The candles in the long gallery at Ravensmere had been lit at 4 o'clock, and by 7, the wax had begun to run down the silver branches in slow ropes, and every woman in that room was wearing something new. Charlotte Ames was not. She stood near the third window with her hands folded at the waist of a gown that had been dyed black 11 months ago and had since surrendered its black to a color that was not quite gray and not quite brown, and she understood, with the particular clarity that arrives when one has stopped hoping for anything, that she had been invited so that the room might have something to look at. Lady Marbury saw her first. She was seated in state near the fire, with her fan held at the height of her collarbone, and she did not lower her voice, because lowering it would have defeated the purpose. "The Threadbare widow," she said. "Poor creature. She has worn that same gown to every house in the county, and she will wear it to her grave, which one imagines cannot be far off given the state of the hem." The women near her laughed the way women laugh when the laughter is a form of agreement rather than amusement. Charlotte did not turn her head. She had learned in 11 months that turning the head was the mistake. She counted the panes in the window instead, which was 6 across and 8 down, 48 in all, and she had counted them twice before she understood that the room had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with her. The Earl of Holbrook had come in from the terrace door. He was a tall man, of 36, with a stillness about him that other men mistook for arrogance, and he crossed the gallery without greeting anyone, which was itself a kind of statement, and he stopped 4 feet from where Charlotte stood and looked at her for the length of 3 full breaths. He said nothing. He looked at the gown, then at her hands, and then at her face, and something happened behind his eyes that she could not read and did not attempt to read, because she had stopped attempting such things on the night her husband's creditors had come through. The door of the house on Wexley Street. "Miss Ames," he said. The words were level. "Mrs. Ames." "Your lordship," she said, though the correction hardly matters. He did not apologize. He did not smile. He turned his head slightly toward the fire, toward Lady Marbury and her fan and her circle of agreeable faces, and he held that look for 2 seconds longer than courtesy required. And then he walked out of the gallery the way he had come. Charlotte stood at the window and felt her own pulse in her throat, and told herself that it meant nothing at all. What she did not yet know was that the Earl of Holbrook had already given an instruction to his coachman, and that the instruction concerned an hour of the morning at which no respectable carriage in England moves. Stay with her a moment. The night is not finished with her yet. Charlotte Ames had been 24 years old, and the wife of a barrister, when the fever took Thomas in the spring, and she had been 25 and a pauper by the summer. The two facts had arrived so close together that she had never fully separated them. Thomas had been kind and clever and catastrophically optimistic, and he had signed his name to a Bristol shipping venture in the January before he died, and the ships had not come, and the men who held his paper had come instead. They had been very polite. They had taken the house on Wexley Street, and the furniture in it, and the little pianoforte her mother had given her, and they had left her the clothes she stood in and a small locked writing box that no one had thought worth the trouble of opening. She had gone to her husband's cousin at Ravensmere, because there had been nowhere else, and the cousin's wife had installed her in a room above the kitchen passage, and had told the county that she was a guest. The county had made its own arrangements about what she was. By September, she had understood the shape of it. She was a woman who could be invited without cost, and displayed without consequence, whose presence at a dinner table proved the hostess's charity, without threatening the hostess's daughters. She was asked to make up numbers. She was seated below the salt. She was spoken of in the third person while standing 4 feet away. And the thing that had surprised her, in the beginning, was how quickly one stops, expecting anything else. Her wound was not the poverty. The poverty could be borne. Her wound was the specific message 11 months had delivered into her hands, like a folded paper, which was that she had become furniture, and that furniture does not get chosen. She had one possession the creditors had missed, and one habit they could not take. The possession was the writing box. The habit was that she rose at 5 and walked, in all weather, along the lane that ran from Ravensmere's kitchen yard down to the village, because at 5 in the morning, nobody in England was looking at her. That was where the child found her. His name was Edward, he was 7 years old, and he was the Earl of Halbrook's son. Charlotte did not know that on the morning she found him sitting in the wet grass at the foot of the lane in November, with his stockings soaked through and his face set in the terrible composed stillness of a child who has decided not to cry. She knew only that he was a boy alone at 5:15, and that the frost had not yet gone off the hedges. "You will be cold," she said. "I am not cold," Edward said. "That is fortunate," Charlotte said, and she sat down in the wet grass beside him, in the gown that had once been black, and she did not touch him, and she did not ask him a single question. She sat. The frost was still on the hedge, and the light was coming up gray. Behind the elms, and somewhere down toward the village, a dog was barking at nothing in particular. Charlotte felt the wet come through the gown at the back of her knees, and did not move. She had learned something in 11 months about people who are waiting to be asked. Every soul at Ravensmere asked her how she did, and every one of them wanted the same 3 words back, and she had come to understand that a question is very often a door being closed. Politely. So she did not ask. She watched the light come up and let the silence do the work. After some minutes the boy said that he had wanted to see whether the lane went anywhere. Charlotte said that it went to the village, and then to the turnpike, and then she supposed to the sea, and that she had never followed it past the church. He considered this with great seriousness. After some more minutes, he told her that his father was at Halbrook Court, and that his father did not speak to him. He said it the way a child reports the weather. He said that his father came to the schoolroom door on Thursdays, and stood in it, and asked Mr. Hayster, Pruitt's clerk, how his sums were coming, and that he had never once come in, and that he had thought, if he walked far enough down the lane, he might find out why. Charlotte thought about that for a long moment. She could have told him that his father was a great man with a great deal on his mind. That would have been the kind lie. And it was the lie the county would have told him. "I do not know why," she said. "Would you like me to walk with you until we find out?" They walked to the village. And back. It was 1.25 miles each way, and it took them the better part of an hour because Edward stopped at the stile to explain the correct method of climbing it, and at the ford to establish which of the stones were sound, and at the churchyard wall to inform her that the yew was 400 years old, which she doubted and did not say so. She gave him her gloves at the ford. They were kid, mended at the thumb with thread that did not match, and they had been her mother's, and they did not fit him at all. He put them on and flexed his fingers inside them, and looked at his own hands with the whole grave satisfaction of a boy who has been given a thing that was not bought for him. "They are too big," Charlotte said. "They are exactly right," Edward said, and pulled them further up his wrists and walked the rest of the way home with his hands held slightly away from his sides, so that nothing should happen to them. At the top of the lane he asked whether she would be there tomorrow. Charlotte said that she walked every morning at 5, in all weather, and that the lane was a public lane, and she had no authority to keep anyone off it. Edward said that this was a very good answer. Then he ran, and she watched him go until the hedge took him. She did not know that a rider had come down from Halbrook Court at 5:10, and had reined in behind the hedge at the top of the lane, and had watched the whole of it. She did not know that he had watched her sit down in the wet grass in a ruined gown, and ask his son nothing at all. She did not know that he had sat his horse in the cold for the better part of an hour, and had not spoken, and had turned at the last, and gone home the long way, so that he would not be seen. At the Fenwick dinner, a week later, Charlotte was seated at the far end of a table, laid for 30. The candelabra were the new French kind, and threw the light forward down the table, which meant that the head of the table was in gold, and the foot of it, where she sat, was in shadow. She thought that a person could build an entire philosophy out of a candelabra. Lady Marbury sat near the head, with her niece beside her. Miss Sophia Vane was 19, in ice blue with a good voice and a better dowry, and she had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice, and she carried that knowledge as pleasantly and as unconsciously as she carried her fan. The Earl of Halbrook was seated opposite Miss Vane. He answered when spoken to. He drank very little. Twice he looked down the length of the table into the shadow, and twice Charlotte was looking at her plate. And once she was not. "You are staring at the foot of the table, my lord," Lady Marbury said, in a voice pitched for the whole room. "There is nothing there but the threadbare widow. She comes with the house. One gathers like the damp." The laughter went along the table in a wave, and Charlotte felt it arrive at her. The way one feels weather arrive. The Earl set down his glass. He did not laugh. He did not look at Lady Marbury. "Mrs. Ames," he said, "the fire has gone down at that end. Come and sit by me." The whole table heard it. Charlotte heard it as a command, and commands from earls are not invitations, and she rose and walked the length of the table with 30 faces turning. And she sat in the chair a footman pulled out beside him, and her hands in her lap were perfectly steady, and her heartbeat was not. He did not speak to her for a quarter of an hour. He simply saw to it that her glass was filled, and that the dish came to her first. And Charlotte, who had been furniture since June, sat in the gold light, and did not know where to put her eyes. She was aware of him, the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room. She could not have said what his face was doing. She could have said without looking that his left hand was resting on the cloth 4 inches from her own, that he had not touched his wine since she sat down, and that when the footman came between them, he had shifted his shoulder a half-inch to keep the man from crowding her chair. She catalogued these things, and then despised herself for cataloguing them. Down the table, Miss Vane was singing the praises of a mare, and doing it charmingly, and getting 3-word answers. Charlotte looked at her plate. Her mother's ring had been sold in July, and the mark of it was still on her finger, a band of skin a shade paler than the rest, and she put her right hand over her left without deciding to. He noticed. She felt him notice. He said nothing about it, and he did not look at her hands again for the rest of the evening, and it was the not looking that undid her, because a man who is indifferent does not trouble himself to be careful. "You walk in the mornings," he said at last, low, without turning his head. "I do. Do not walk past the mill road. The bank is undercut." That was all. He turned back to Miss Vane and answered a question about horses. Charlotte sat beside him for the remainder of the dinner and understood, with a sinking that surprised her, that she had been rescued the way one rescues a dog from the rain, and that the kindness of great men is a thing they hand out and then forget by morning. She was wrong. She had no way of knowing she was wrong. Later that week, her husband's cousin's wife came up to the room above the kitchen passage, and she stood in the doorway and did not sit down, and she said that Mr. Fullerby Ames had a proposal to lay before Charlotte, and that Charlotte would find it generous. Mr. Gracel? Julian Ames was Thomas's second cousin and the heir to the Wexley Street property that the creditors had taken, and he had spent 11 months buying that paper back at 9 pence in the pound, and he had a lawyer's understanding of what a widow is worth when she has nothing. He came the next afternoon in a new coat. He explained at some length, and with real satisfaction, that he now held every scrap of Thomas's debt, that the sum was £4,000, that the law permitted him certain remedies against a widow's person, that he would very much prefer not to pursue, and that all of it could be made to disappear on the morning she consented to marry him. "You're being sentimental about a dead man," Julian said. "Sentiment is expensive. I am offering you the only door in the room." Charlotte looked at the coat and at the new gloves and at the small, pleased set of his mouth, and she said that she required a week. "You require nothing," he said. "You are a threadbare widow in a borrowed room. Take the door, Charlotte." He gave her until the Ravensmere ball. It was to be held on the 9th of December in the same long gallery where the candles ran down the silver branches, and the whole county would be there. That night Charlotte opened the writing box for the first time since June. Inside was a letter Thomas had written her the week they were married and never sent, which she had found among his papers, and which she had never been able to read past the second line. She did not read it that night either. She put her hand flat on it and left it in the box. She had 6 days. She began, methodically, to look for £4,000 in a county where she owned nothing. She found what she had known she would find. On the fourth day she walked to Holbrook Court, which was 2 miles. In the rain, because Edward had sent her a note in a 7-year-old's hand, asking whether she would come and see the gallery, and because she had promised him she would, and because a promise made to a child at 5 in the morning is not a thing one breaks on account of weather. She did not intend to see the Earl. The footman took her to the long room where the pictures hung, and Edward showed her a horse and a ship and a great-grandmother in a ruff. And then he stopped in front of a place on the wall where the paper was a shade darker than the paper around it, in the exact shape of a portrait that was no longer there. "That was my mother," Edward said. "Father had it taken down." Charlotte did not have time to answer, because the Earl of Holbrook was standing in the doorway, and he had been standing there for some while. He went still the way he had gone, still in the wet grass, and Charlotte, watching the boy's shoulders come up around his ears, felt something in her chest turn over that had nothing to do with propriety, or rank, or the £4,000 waiting for her at Ravensmere. "He asked me a question," she said, "and I did not know the answer. Perhaps you do." Nobody had spoken to the Earl of Holbrook in that manner in 9 years. He came into the room. He stood before the darker rectangle of paper with his hands at his sides, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, and Charlotte understood she had gone too far. "And did not retract it, Edward," he said. "Go to Mrs. Spotchus, Hale, and ask for your tea." The boy went. The door closed. The rain moved against the tall windows in a long, soft rush. "Her name was Anne," the Earl said. "She died 4 years ago in February, and she asked for me, and I was in London for 11 days over a matter of drainage rights that I could have settled by letter. Mrs. Hale sent for me on the 2nd day. I did not come until the 10th. He said it in the same level voice he used about horses. "I took the portrait down, because my son used to stand in front of it and wait. He would stand there until his legs gave out. And I found I could not tell him that his mother was not coming, and I could not stand in the room while he waited, and so I removed the room, instead of the grief that was the coward's arithmetic. I have done it every day since." Charlotte's hands had gone cold. She said the only thing she had. "He was in the lane at 5 in the morning," she said, "to find out why you do not speak to him. You might simply tell him." The Earl looked at her then fully, the way he had looked at her in the gallery. Among the running candles, rain on the glass, a fire going down, 2 people at the wrong distance for the room they were standing in. "You are the only person in this county," he said, "who has said a true thing to me since Anne died." He crossed half the space between them and stopped. His hand came up and did not arrive. It hovered at the level of her jaw, close enough that she felt the warmth come off it against her cheek, and neither of them breathed. And Charlotte thought, with perfect and useless clarity, that if he touched her she would not step back, and that she wanted him to, and that wanting was a luxury priced far above £4,000. He lowered his hand. "You should not be here in the rain," he said. "I will send you back in the carriage." "I will walk," Charlotte said. She walked. She was 2 miles and 40 minutes alone with what her own body had told her, and she arrived at Ravensmere soaked through and shaking. And it was not the cold. If she has your heart already, stay to the end. She has 4 days left, and she does not know it. On the 6th day, the 9th of December, the long gallery at Ravensmere was lit at 4 o'clock and filled by 8, and Charlotte came down in the gown that had once been black because she had no other gown, and she came down because Julian had made it clear that her answer would be given in public or it would be given to a magistrate. Lady Marbury had arranged the evening the way a general arranges a field. Miss Vane was at the head of the room in ice blue. Julian was beside the fire with a paper folded in his breast pocket, and he had shown that paper to 11 people before 9 o'clock, because a debt is only a debt in private and a scandal in company. The Earl of Holbrook arrived at 9:30, and did not come near her. Charlotte watched him take Miss Vane's hand and lead her out for the second set, and she watched Lady Marbury's fan drop half an inch in satisfaction, and she felt the last small, foolish thing inside her put itself away. At 10 o'clock, Julian crossed the floor and asked her, in a voice designed to carry, for her answer. "No," Charlotte said. The music did not stop because music does not stop, and that was somehow worse. Julian smiled. He took the paper from his breast pocket and unfolded it and read out pleasantly. The sum of £4,000, and the name of the dead man who had incurred it. And he told the long gallery at Ravensmere that Mrs. Charlotte Ames was insolvent and that he had offered his name to her out of family duty, and that she had refused it out of vanity. Lady Marbury's voice came in over the top of it, high and clear and delighted. "Well," she said. One did wonder how long the threadbare widow would be permitted to play. The Lady Vanity in A Woman with Nothing is the purest comedy the season has offered. The room laughed. Not all of it. Enough of it. Charlotte stood in the center of the long gallery with 40 faces turned toward her, and the candles running down the silver branches, and she did not weep, and she did not answer. She was aware, with a clarity that felt almost restful of a great many small things at once, of the heat of the branch of candles at her right shoulder, of the fact that the musicians had gone on playing and that the second violin was slightly behind of Mrs. Fenwick, near the card-room door, looking at the floor and not at her, which was its own kind of verdict, of Julian's paper still open in his hand, held at exactly the angle at which a man holds a thing he wishes to be seen holding. The thing that undid her was not the laughter. She had been laughed at since June, and had built a room inside herself to keep it in. It was that she looked, without meaning to, toward the terrace door. He was not there. The terrace door stood open on the cold, and there was nobody in it, and Charlotte understood in that moment exactly how much hope she had been carrying without permission, because she felt the whole weight of it go. She walked the length of the gallery alone. 200 feet of parquet and running wax and turned faces, and nobody stopped her, and she did not hurry, because hurrying would have been the mistake, and she had learned in 11 months precisely which mistake she could not afford. At the foot of the stairs, her husband's cousin's wife was waiting with her hands folded. She was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one, which in that county amounted to the same arithmetic. She said that Mr. Ames had been very generous, and that Charlotte had been very foolish, and that the house could not be seen to keep her now, and that it might be best if she were gone by the end of the week. "Thank you," Charlotte said, "for the room," and went up. In the room above the kitchen passage, Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed in the ruined gown until the house went quiet. Then she opened the writing box and took out the letter Thomas had never sent, and this time she read the whole of it, and it said that he had been afraid of the ships and had not told her, and that if it all came apart she was to remember that she had married a fool and not a coward, and that she was to go on being the only person he had ever met who told the truth at the wrong moment. Charlotte laughed once, wetly, in the dark, and folded it, and put it back in the box, and did not sleep. At 6 o'clock she had made her decision. She would go to the village, and she would take work, and she would be a woman who scrubbed a floor, and owed nothing, and the county could say what it liked, because the county had already said it. At 6:20 there was a knock at the kitchen door. At 6:30, in the grey before dawn on the 10th of December, the Earl of Halbrook's carriage stood in the kitchen yard at Ravensmere, with its lamps still burning, and his coachman was standing bareheaded in the frost asking for Mrs. Mette. Ames, the scullery maid, came up the back stairs at a run and could not get the sentence out whole. Charlotte went down in the gown she had not taken off. The yard was blue with the last of the dark, and there were 4 horses in the frost, with the steam coming off their backs, and the lamps were still lit because the carriage had been driven through the night, and on the door, plain enough to be read from the kitchen window by anyone who cared to look, was the Halbrook crest. The coachman held his hat against his chest. He had been at Halbrook Court 40 years, and he did not blink. "His lordship's compliments, madam," he said. "He asks whether you will come." Charlotte stood in the frost in a ruined gown with the whole of the kitchen staff behind her in the doorway. "He asks," she said. He was most particular about the word madam. By 7 the house was awake. By 8, the county was awake. A carriage sent at dawn is not a discreet thing. 4 horses and lit lamps in a kitchen yard at 6:30 can be seen from the lane, and from the vicarage, and from the window of the room where Lady Marbury took her chocolate. And the Earl of Holbrook, who had spent 9 years being talked about and had never once given the county anything true to say, had not intended it to be discreet at all. Charlotte rode the 2 miles to Halbrook Court with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart going like a bird in a box, and she was taken not to the drawing room but to the library, where a fire had been built up and a solicitor named Mr. Prost. Pruitt was sitting at a table with an inkstand, and 3 documents in front of him, and where the Earl of Holbrook stood at the window, in the grey light, and turned when she came in. "Sit down," he said. "Eat something." "You have not eaten since yesterday afternoon." She sat down. She did not eat. "I left the ball at 10 o'clock, he said. "I went to Bristol at midnight." "Mr. Pruitt has been buying your husband's paper back from Mr. Ball, Lowell. Julian Ames since Tuesday at par. Through a broker whose name your cousin does not know, because I have known for a week what he intended, and I did not choose to warn you before I could end it." Charlotte could not make her voice work. "He holds nothing," the Earl said. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, the debt is discharged. Mr. Pruitt has the receipts. You owe no man in England £4,000, and you owe me nothing. And if you walk out of this room now, that remains true." The fire moved. The solicitor kept his eyes on his inkstand like a man who has learned the exact value of his own invisibility. "Why?" Charlotte said. The Earl of Holbrook crossed the library and stopped in front of her, closer than he had stood in the picture gallery, and his voice, when it came, was not level at all. "Because you sat down in the wet grass," he said. "Because you gave a strange child your gloves, and asked him nothing. Because you told me the truth about my son in a room I had emptied so that I would not have to hear it. I did not come to the gallery to look at your gown, Charlotte. I have not been able to look anywhere else since October, and I have been telling myself for 2 months that a man who let his wife die alone has no business wanting anything. And last night I stood in a doorway and let a room laugh at you, and I discovered exactly how much that cowardice is worth to me." It was the first time he had used her name. Charlotte stood up. Her legs did not want to hold her, and she made them. "Say the rest of it," she said. "I want you," he said. "Not as a charity, not as a duty to a dead man's widow. I have wanted you since the lane, and I have been a coward about it in precisely the way I have been a coward about everything since February 4 years ago. And I am done with the arithmetic." He did not touch her. He waited. That was the whole of it, that he waited, and Charlotte, who had been furniture since June, put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heart going as hard as hers, and neither of them moved for the length of a long breath, because what came next could not be unmade. She rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was soft and it was full of promise, and it went on a moment longer than either of them had planned. And when she came down off her toes, his hand was at the small of her back and his forehead was against hers, and he had stopped breathing altogether. "There will be a scandal," she said. "There will be a wedding," he said. "The scandal is a matter of timing." The Marbury 12th night ball was held in the long gallery at Ravensmere, because Lady Marbury had taken the gallery for the season and would not surrender it, and because the county had been talking of nothing else for 4 weeks, and she intended to control what it said. Charlotte came in at 9 o'clock on the Earl of Halbrook's arm. The gown was new. It was a soft green, and it was not remarked upon because nobody in that gallery was looking at the gown. Miss Vane was near the fire in ice blue with her aunt's hand at her elbow. Julian Ames stood by the card-room door, with the expression of a man who has read a document he did not expect. The music stopped. Not because anyone stopped it. It simply thinned and went out the way sound does when a room decides to listen. Lady Marbury came forward with her fan at her collarbone and her face arranged, and she made the last calculation of her career. "Your lordship," she said, "you have brought your charity with you." The Earl of Holbrook let the silence stand. He let it stand for 3 full seconds, which in a gallery of 200 people is a very long time, and Charlotte felt every one of them. He said, "Lady Marbury, this is my wife." The fan came down. It came down slowly, and then all at once, and Lady Marbury's mouth opened and produced no sound, and then produced a syllable, and then stopped. Mr. Brate. Pruitt stepped out from the wall with the register in his hand, and said to nobody in particular and to everybody that the marriage had been solemnized at Holbrook Parish Church at 8 o'clock that evening by common license, and that he had witnessed it himself. The room turned. Charlotte felt it turn. 40 faces, and then 80, and then all of them, and it was not the turning of a crowd being told what to think. It was the turning of a crowd remembering what it had already seen, and had chosen for 11 months not to look at. Old Mrs. Fenwick said clearly, into the quiet, "She sat with my kitchen maid the whole night the girl had the fever. Nobody asked her to. Someone else said that she had walked to the village in the rain. Someone else said the thing about the boy in the lane which had been in the county for 2 months, and had been repeated as evidence of her strangeness, and which was now being repeated as something else entirely." Miss Vane looked at Charlotte for a long moment. Then she stepped away from her aunt's elbow, and crossed 6 feet of floor, and curtsied, and said, "Lady Holbrook," and there was nothing in her face but a 19-year-old girl discovering, rather early, that she had been given the wrong script. Lady Marbury stood alone by the fire, with her fan at her side, and her circle rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. And nobody was cruel to her, and nobody needed to be. She sat down. She sat down because her legs required it, and she did not speak again that evening. And in March she wrote to Charlotte, and the letter was stiff and correct and contained, in its 4th line, an apology. Julian Ames left before midnight. He had been paid at par, and could not complain of it, which was, Charlotte thought later, the most exact punishment available. The Earl of Holbrook did not make a speech. He had crossed the room once and said 7 words, and the 7 words had cost him a great deal and had been worth all of it, and he spent the rest of the evening standing at his wife's shoulder, saying almost nothing which the county understood perfectly well. It snowed in the last week of January. Charlotte woke early, out of habit at 5, and lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the particular hush a house takes on when there is snow against the windows. And then she got up and went along the corridor at Holbrook Court in her wrapper. The portrait had been rehung in the long gallery in the 2nd week of the month. Anne, Countess of Holbrook, in a white gown with her hair up, painted the year before Edward was born. It had been Edward's decision where it should hang. He had chosen the space between the 2 tall windows, because he said that was where the light came in the mornings, and Charlotte had held his hand while the footman raised it and had not said a word. She found the boy there, now, at 5:10, in his nightshirt and his stockings, standing in front of it. "You will be cold," Charlotte said. "I am not cold," Edward said. And then after a moment, "I was telling her about the snow." Charlotte sat down on the floor of the long gallery in her wrapper, which was not a thing a countess does, and Edward sat down beside her. And they looked at his mother in the gray light with the snow coming down outside the 2 tall windows. They were still there when the Earl of Holbrook found them a quarter of an hour later. He stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, and looked at the 2 of them on the floor, at his wife in her wrapper and his son in his stockings, and Charlotte watched him arrive at the edge of the room and stop there the way he had stopped in doorways for 4 years. She did not say anything. She moved 6 inches to the left and left a space on the boards. He came in. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and his son under one arm in the cold, in his shirt sleeves. And he was quiet for a while, and then he told Edward about the winter his mother had put a snowball down the back of his collar, in the rose garden, and had run, and had been caught, because she had always been a slow runner, and had never once let it stop her running. Edward laughed out loud, helplessly, the sound going up into the height of the gallery, for the first time in 4 years. Charlotte took her husband's hand. In her sitting room upstairs, the writing box stood open on the table where she had left it the night before, and inside it was a folded letter from a dead man who had loved her, which she no longer needed to read because she had learned the whole of it by heart. She had married a fool and not a coward. She had told the truth at the wrong moment. It had cost her everything she owned and had bought her a house with snow at the windows, and a boy laughing on the floor, and a man who had crossed a room in front of 200 people to say her name. The snow came down on the two tall windows and did not stop. Thank you for staying with her until the end.